Hello everyone, it's Dr. Sam Hurst, and this is the 12th in our series of the October Gothic a Day Tempts the Vampires to Stay. Now, it's the last in our series looking at that early British and Irish Gothic period from 1764 to about 1830. As usual, I'm going to be introducing a text, giving you some idea of why it's important, giving you some idea of the plot, and some reading recommendations. And that last part is going to be the easiest because I'm talking today about one of the most famous authors of that early period, but I'm not talking about her most famous work. So that's going to be one of my recommendations. If you haven't already guessed, I am, of course, going to be talking about Mary Shelley. You might have been missing her. I'm not going to be talking about Frankenstein, though, from 1818. Rather, I'm going to be talking about her 1826 novel, The Last Man. Now, why am I not thinking about Frankenstein today? Well, in part because it is so famous, and I don't have a great deal to add that you won't already know from reading it or encountering it in popular culture. I can, of course, give some ideas if anybody wants to ask me about it. I'm also wanting to not choose Frankenstein because I always think it's a little bit sad that Mary Shelley is so connected to Frankenstein and nothing else, and it sort of blots out the rest of her work. Because Frankenstein is great. I love it. It's amazing. It's rich, it's textured, it's layered, but it's not everything that she wrote. And Mary Shelley's work is fascinating. She doesn't always write the most polished work, some of her longer fiction, and I think this applies to The Last Man for me personally, but her ideas and what she is doing imaginatively is fascinating. She's really at the forefront of a lot of tropes and storylines that will become central and important in speculative fiction throughout sort of up to the modern period. So in Frankenstein, you might be aware, it's often thought of as being an early science fiction novel, and certainly that sort of animation of the inanimate. You've also got The Last Man that we're talking about today, a really early example of a post-apocalyptic novel, effectively. You've also got short stories about ghosts, dreams, evil doubles, Romans coming back to life, incestuous desire, immortality. You've got such a wide range of stories that are fun and exciting to read that it's a shame that we only ever really find out about Frankenstein. Well, what about this book today? What about The Last Man? What's it about? Well, quite clearly, it's about the last man. The last man alive on Earth, or so he thinks. The last man alive on Earth is Lionel. We meet him when he's a youth, full of hatred and anger because of what's happened to his family, because of a misunderstanding, a letter that went awry. And his anger is centered on the king. But that all changes when he meets the king's son, Adrian, and falls in love, makes great friends. And Adrian inculcates in him a love of philosophy. And they become friends for life, along with Raymond as well. Now, the three of them are loosely based on real-life people, it's often considered, and there's certainly shades in there, with Lionel sometimes figuring as a sort of Mary Shelley, Adrian as a sort of Percy Shelley, and Raymond very clearly as a Byronic figure. Now, throughout the text, there's a great deal of interrelationships, marriages, trauma, two men loving the same woman who then escapes. There's a bit of betrayal, there's misunderstandings. But what's perhaps most important is what else is going on in the novel. So it's not the plague straight away. The plague that's going to wipe out mankind doesn't really come until the second book. But the first book, and a lot of the early part of the text, is dealing with politics. Now, Adrian's father was the last king of England, and his mother wants him to take the throne back, but Adrian's a Republican. He's just not into it. So there's an investigation of Republican sentiment here. Although there is a turn back that when the plague comes, when everything is at its worst, when we're being invaded, then it's Adrian who takes the fall, not the leader of the Popular Democratic Party who runs away to stay with his stores. There's various amounts of trauma, various main characters die as we go through, but what's important is that Adrian and Lionel get to the continent where they're seeking a sort of better climb to try and survive this plague and the vicissitudes of nature as well. When they get to France, there's problems with cults. I mean, that's an obvious trope that we see so much in post-apocalyptic and dystopian fiction nowadays. The sort of religious cult who is manipulating the situation, and there's an imposter who's telling people that if you stay with me, you'll be healed, you will be safe. But of course it isn't true. Eventually they sort of manage to not defeat the cult, but convince everybody that the leader is an imposter, and they make their way over the mountains. But literally sort of everybody dies except Lionel and Adrian, Lionel's son Evelyn, and Clara, who is the daughter of Lionel's sister Perdita, and Raymond, who died a long time ago in Greece after being blown up. And it all looks like maybe they're going to be a lovely found family, except then Evelyn dies, and then they go boating in the middle of a storm, and rather inevitably Adrian and Clara also die. We're left with Lionel wandering the ruins of Europe. What's really interesting about this story, there's a lot of things that are interesting, quite frankly, but one of them is how it's framed narratively. It's set up as though Mary Shelley herself had found on a visit to Naples in a cave some Sibylline leaves with a prophecy on them in the form of a sort of retrospective diary of these end times, a retrospective diary that was fragmented and in pieces and that had to be reconstructed. So there's a really interesting kind of narratorial technique going on there. Also, it's fascinating as an early example of this post-apocalyptic or dystopian fiction. And those are very defined categories, which The Last Man doesn't quite fit into either, but they're sort of useful to think about where it's fitting into, what it's on the edge of. And you can certainly see the influence of its tropes and plot points in later fiction. Although at the time it wasn't very popular, it was rescued in the sort of 1960s. And its influence, I would argue, is still felt today. It's a fascinating read anyway. And particularly, I've always loved this imagination of the 21st century that Mary Shelley has. Because everyone still speaks in the rhetoric of sentimentality and sensibility. There's still massive discourses of honour. The clothes haven't really changed. But her vision of the future does include a little bit of technology. My favourite thing, because everyone apparently in 21st century Europe will be travelling by hot air balloon. Which is great, isn't it? It's a lovely idea. It's an interesting read and it's a fascinating read. I've given you a very brief outline of the main plot points, but there's so much more in there that it's impossible to get through in a small video like this. Now, if you're wanting to read more Mary Shelley, obviously start with Frankenstein, but I can also recommend to you a variety of her different stories. Some of my sort of favourites or the most intriguing are Matilda, which is the story of incestuous desire. It's very troubling. And it was so troubling to Godwin, Mary Shelley's father, that when she sent it to him, he refused to give it back. We also have, and I would recommend, The Mortal Immortal, which I've recommended before. And also, one that's always intrigued me is The Dream by Mary Shelley, and what it's doing and saying about conceptions and understandings of the dream in the period. You can't go wrong, though, wherever you start and whatever you pick up with Mary Shelley. It's bound to be an adventure. So I wish you luck and happy explorations. And I hope you have more luck than poor Lionel.